My name's Paul Russell. Kevin was supposed to introduce me for this next talk. It's probably good that he didn't because it just would have been full of insults anyway. Now, this time after lunch is a traditional time when you try and fall asleep and I wish I could join you. So, to sort of break that little cycle, I want you to do something for me. It is great to be here, isn't it? Yes. So why don't you turn to the person next to you, shake their hand firmly and say, it's great to be here. Thank you. Well done. Well done. Okay. Terrific. Okay. All right, I think I've started something. Attention. Okay. Here we go. As I said, my name's Paul Russell. I run an organisation called HOPE, Preventing Euthanasia and Assisted Suicide. Kevin stole my name. In Australia, we've been running it now for 5 years. I've been working full-time on it for 3 years. I'm the Vice Chair of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, so I'm sort of Alex's sort of colleague, I guess, and part of the international movement. It's great to be with you here. I come from Adelaide in South Australia, which for many years was really the epicentre of euthanasia activity anywhere in the world, with up to 5 euthanasia bills on the notice paper in our parliament at any one time over a number of years. Thankfully, I can say we defeated them all. My wife Anne and I have 7 children. Our third son, Joseph, has Down syndrome. An old friend who comes from very near here told me when Joseph was born that he thought that God had sent us an angel. Well, he ain't. But he's a great lad and he's the apple of his old man's eye. And I count myself incredibly fortunate to have a personal relationship with the disability community in Australia, going way back till when I first met my brother-in-law, Mark. Mark had a profound intellectual disability and he lived in a community that was styled on the work of Jean Vanier, who I'm sure you've heard of. He changed my life in deep and unexplainable ways, I must say. And you know, you've heard it here already today. In the opposition to euthanasia and assisted suicide, you will find plenty of references to this notion of vulnerable people and the risk that any euthanasia or assisted suicide laws would visit upon this group of people. And when we think of vulnerable people, we may well think of people living with a disability, in the same way that we will think of the frail elderly and the issue of elder abuse, which is rife in the Western world at the moment. But this abuse of the elderly is something that we can all easily talk about. We can seek justice and dignity for those who are suffering elder abuse. We all know elderly people. I'm sure everyone in this room one day aspires to be an elderly person. And these people are, by their very nature of their abuse, voiceless. They need our voices. But I put it to you that the disability community is different. It's made up of young and old, people born with a disability and people who have acquired one, people who have overcome barriers to social equity and those who may never quite do so. And I don't really claim any right to speak for disabled persons by and large. They can and do and should speak very well for themselves. Earlier speakers outlined the very real risk that euthanasia and assisted suicide presents not only on individual persons, these vulnerable persons, but also how the existence of such laws creates subtle and dangerous changes in perception and attitude in a society where such laws exist. Your own courts recognised these perils in the judgment in the Fleming case not so long ago. At some distance, while we are all deeply concerned with the issue of euthanasia and assisted suicide, we do so rightly out of a sense of true compassion, fair play, human rights and justice for others. The risk to ourselves, we assume, though I think incorrectly, is somewhat more remote. Not so for people living with disability. People living with disability face barriers to social equity and inclusion every single day of their lives. It varies from country to country and place to place, no doubt, but it can most easily be recognised in the organisations of people living with disability who are pushing for structural change in social policy, essentially for a fair go. They are loud, they are visible, and they're out there, and they need to be. They don't need our voice, but they welcome all of us to stand with them, and so we should. Most, in my experience, oppose the introduction of euthanasia and assisted suicide. Why? Because they say they see themselves as the targets. This was made chillingly obvious in the Canadian Supreme Court decision in the Carter case recently that opened the door to euthanasia in North America. The court specifically identified disability as a reason someone might seek euthanasia. How do you feel? But it's much more than that. People like my colleagues at Lives Worth Living, a disability anti-euthanasia group in Australia, will tell you how their lives have been diminished in medical care, how doctors have assumed that they would not want to keep on living if a medical procedure went wrong, simply because the doctors have made a subjective value judgment about the quality of their lives. The subtle message they hear on a regular basis from medicos and from some others in society is that their lives have less intrinsic value than others and that perhaps they would be better off dead. No wonder they fear giving the power to kill to doctors. And this in a country like Australia that is completely overturning the former charity and dependency model in disability support into a model whereby each and every Australian living with a disability is guaranteed for life access to the supports that they need in a self-driven program known as the National Disability Insurance Scheme. That's about dignity. That's about access and inclusion. But you know, even that won't change attitudes. No, not overnight. Then there are reports you hear from the UK from time to time where even the basics of living, such as a place to live independently, are scarce, where lack of access to the most basic of social supports has driven some to suicide. There is no choice there. Recently, Scottish MSP Siobhan McMahon told the Scottish Parliament that discussions about the assisted suicide bill in Scotland had added to the demonisation of disabled people. She told her fellow MSPs, and I quote, "It's not a medical condition that makes disabled people's lives intolerable. It's the lack of social care, health services, accessible housing, transport, and well-funded welfare benefits." She said the bill, quote, "reinforces the stereotype that disabled people are a burden and do not contribute to society. A stereotype that could not be further from the truth and must not be given validity today, tomorrow, or any time in the future." Now, it would be wrong of me if I've given you the impression that Australia has somehow got it right, but I think we're actually heading in the right direction. But, you know, strange things happen. Anne and I occasionally get letters from officialdom in government asking us, for example, to prove that Joseph still has Down syndrome. So, hey, I mean, how do you prove it anyway? But anyway, you know, we had a recent disability summit. This is a peak body in Melbourne, at a Melbourne hotel, where there was no access for wheelchair-using speakers to the podium and where the accessible toilets were being used as a chair cupboard. Recently, a family was refused immigration on the basis that their son, also with Down syndrome, would be a drain on taxpayers. So, you know, discrimination isn't fixed that easily. Changing attitudes takes much more than that. I would venture to say, however, that the presence of a strong, organised disability activist group is a very good sign. We need to make sure that their voices are able to be heard and that their messages are heeded. You know, it's not purely, if not purely from a sense of doing what is right, then at least because a society that is not focused on eliminating discrimination, is not focused on providing ethical structural support for those in need, is abandoning one of its primary roles and reasons for existence, ultimately to their peril. And I put it to you that if you don't actually have a very visible disability activist presence in your country, raising hell around the place, as they very often do, it can only really mean one of three things. One, that you've got it all perfectly right here in Erin and it really is heaven on earth, as many of you will tell me it is, I'm sure. Or two, you have a dependency charitable model that sucks the spirit out of people, regardless of good intention and good works. Or three, you're like Belgium, or you're like the Netherlands, which you certainly are not. When I finish speaking, we'll be getting Tom Mortier from Belgium to speak to us about his story. And I asked him once why he thought there was no obvious disability groups in his country standing up against their law. After all, you know, they exist almost everywhere. Why not Belgium? He told me in reply that people living with disability in his country are very well supported towards becoming productive members of the community. But then he added a caveat to the effect that the focus on achieving potential is highly utilitarian, that those who cannot jump this high hurdle in Belgian society are shunned, they have no voice. So then the question is, what is a productive member of the community, and who decides and who sets the standard? In his book, You Call This a Life, Blurred Boundaries of the Netherlands' Right to Die Laws, I think there are some copies available, Alex probably has some, author Herbert van Lonen chronicles the slide Holland has taken over many years into effective euthanasia on demand. A critical point in these developments was the publishing of a text called Medical Power and Medical Ethics in 1969. Here, according to van Lonen, author Jack Hendrik van den Berg begins a discussion about futility in terms of medical assistance for disabled people. You'll hear that word futility moving around in these circles quite a bit. Van Lonen summarises like this, and I quote, "Van den Berg's influential booklet bears this striking feature. Disabled and ill individuals are only examples, objects in an argument. Whether they're mentally competent or not, able to speak or not, Van den Berg never gives them a voice. They are merely objects in a display of what medical power can lead to. Look, these people are still alive, but should we be pleased about it? Wouldn't it have been better that a physician had never treated them? Wouldn't it be better that the physician would let them or cause them to die now?" End of quote. Van Lonen also quotes Dutch ethicist Hans Reinders, who in turn cites the German remedial educationalist Emil Kolb, describing this phenomenon. He says, "When there is nothing more to do, to examine or to do, the researchers and doers are confronted with the possible futility of their own actions. And this must not be allowed to happen. Physicians cannot allow the disabled individual to simply be. They must help him develop." Emil Kolb summarises this belief by saying, "What does not become something is nothing." Oh, there you have it. What does not become something is nothing. How vile. The Dutch and Belgians have comprehensively failed to make the distinction between human potential and the intrinsic worth of the human person. What does not become something is nothing, indeed. Even this idea of development and independence here is tainted, because such development is not seen as a good end in itself, but rather an expectation placed upon the individual by these societies for membership. Who remembers between the world wars the 1920 German publication of Hock and Binding, permitting the destruction of life unworthy of life, and how that inspired the Nazi destruction of many of Germany's disabled persons that ultimately led to the final solution? Is it any wonder that disability groups to this day still use the black triangle patch in their logos? You know, trouble is too few do remember. Useless eaters. Human ballast. This is truly frightening. It's human nature at its worst, I think. And in the context of euthanasia, it further reinforces the problem, as we have seen in the Canadian Supreme Court, that there's no boundary between any definition of terminal illness or disability. Many, many times in the Australian press, stories of people who want euthanasia because of an onset of a disabling condition. You've seen that here yourself. They will say they don't want to have to rely on others to feed them, to toilet them, to bathe them, and to change them. And a largely uncritical populace nods in agreement, not realising that there are plenty of people who live every day with those kind of supports. Any wonder that people living with disabilities say, "They're talking about me." And when a society confirms in law that such lives are indeed not worth living, I fear for my son. So in the words of Lenin, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, what is to be done? There is much to be learned. I find myself being challenged continuously by my disabled friends, particularly through social media. They're so active in that area. And I'm sure we could all do with such a reality check from time to time. Get connected, folks. Get involved. In terms of euthanasia and assisted suicide, we know prevention's better than cure. Don't think that it won't happen here. You've already had a small taste of how this bad idea can gain traction. And our friend Kevin is playing the prophet for your nation. Get connected, support him, support this work, get involved. Make a firm decision to focus on human dignity and compassion. It's bad ideas we stand against, not against individuals. If we're to be genuine about human dignity and about true human rights that spring therefrom, there is no room for hate. there is no room for derision. To make a real difference, to build a better society, we need to focus on human rights, on dignity and social equity. Because, in lives spent caring for others, there is little room for the kind of ableist and elitist death agenda that euthanasia and assisted suicide represents. If we get that right, we strengthen society against such bad ideas. So not only do we need to stop these laws, we need to build a better and fairer society for everyone to live in. That has to be part of our goal as well. Euthanasia and assisted suicide, they're simply bad ideas. Thank you.